All right, hey guys. All right, so today we need to start chapter 8. And so chapter 8 is all about joints. So a joint is any place where two bones articulate relative to each other. Two bones should never touch each other. If two bones ever touch each other, you're going to be in a lot of pain. So there needs to be something between two bones where they move relative to each other, and that's what a joint is. And there are different types of joints. So there are different ways to classify the different types of joints. The first type of classification is the functional classification. So we're going to discuss these terms briefly, but I'll go ahead and tell you that the functional classification is not the form that your textbook uses. Your textbook actually uses the structural classification, and that's what we're going to be looking at once we get past this slide. Okay, so there are three different types of joints when we look at the functional classification. The first is called the synarthrosis, or you could also refer to it as a synarthrotic joint. This is an immovable joint, and it can be fibrous or cartilaginous. And what it means to be fibrous or cartilaginous, we'll talk about in a moment. The second type of joint is an amphiarthrosis, or you could call it an amphiarthrotic joint. This one is slightly movable. Again, it can be fibrous or cartilaginous. And the third type of joint is referred to as a diarthrosis or a diarthrotic joint. This guy is freely movable. It's going to give you the greatest range of motion, and it always includes synovial joints. And what a synovial joint is, we will talk about. Okay? All right, so those are your three different types of joints when we look at functional classification. You know, how much motion can you get out of the joint? But moving forward, we're going to focus on the structural classification. And we look at the structural classification. There also happen to be three different categories. So the first category is the fibrous joint. So in the fibrous joint, the bones are bound together by dense fibrous connective tissue. And it's mainly that dense regular connective tissue. And we know that dense regular connective tissue is really just a bunch of collagen fibers going in the same direction. Okay, so fibrous joints contain dense regular connective tissue. There is no joint cavity. What a joint cavity is, we will see in the coming slides. And it's immovable. So right, there's not really going to be a lot of movement in between these bones where you have fibrous joints. The second category is the cartilaginous joints. So here bones are connected by cartilage, and specifically it's either going to be hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage. Again, there won't be a joint cavity, and you still don't have a lot of movement between the bones relative to each other in cartilaginous joints. And then the third category is the synovial joints. Now these are the most movable, so this is where you get the greatest range of motion. And each joint contains a fluid-filled joint cavity. Most joints in the human body are in this class. And when most people think of a joint in between bones, they're thinking of synovial joints, okay? So what we want to do is look at each category of joints with the structural classification and look at them in more detail. And so we're going to start with the fibrous joints. Okay, so on this particular slide, we're looking at the different types of fibrous joints. So when we think about a fibrous joint, we've got adjoining bones united by collagenic fibers. So collagenic fibers, that's going to be that dense regular connective tissue. Okay, so laser pointer. There are three different types of fibrous joints. We've got a suture, a syndesmosis, and a gomphosis. And then over here, it tells you how much mobility you have with each type of fibrous joint. So for a suture, it's pretty much immobile. So that's what we refer to as the synarthrosis. For the syndesmosis, we've got some slight movement. So this would be an example of an amphiarthrosis. And then for the gomphosis, again, pretty immobile. So that would be a synarthrotic joint, okay? Now for exam 3, you've got to learn the examples of each type of fibrous joint, and so we see those in the little panels over here. So in the suture, this is going to be a joint held together with very short interconnecting fibers and bone edges that interlock. And this is found only in the skull. And so if you remember back before spring break in exercise 9, you guys were learning the names of some of the sutures in between the bones and the skull. And the names of those sutures, those are actually joints, and in between those bones is dense, regular connective tissue. Okay, so that's your example for a suture, pretty straightforward. And then when you get over here to the syndesmosis, joints held together by a ligament. We know what a ligament is, right? It's dense, regular connective tissue. The fibrous tissue can vary in length, but it's longer than in sutures. Okay, so we have a dense, regular connective tissue that's connecting bone to bone. Your example for exam 3 is that a syndesmosis occurs between fibula and tibia. And these are bones that are in the lower part of the leg. You'll see that in lab this coming week, okay, when you do the appendicular skeleton. And then for the gomphosis, this is a peg and socket fibrous joint, and it involves the periodontal ligament, which holds your teeth in their socket. And so whether you're thinking about a tooth that's in the lower part of your jaw or the upper part of your jaw, those teeth are not supposed to move. They are held in their socket by a periodontal ligament, which again is dense, regular connective tissue. And that again is true whether or not you're referring to the mandible or the maxilla. That's going to be a gomphosis. Okay, so those are your 3 different types of fibrous joints. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, so for the cartilaginous joints, there's only 2 of these guys. So here you've got adjoining bones united by cartilage. And this includes a synchondrosis, which is immobile. And a synchondrosis involves hyaline cartilage. Then you've got the symphysis, which is slightly movable, and it involves fibrocartilage. All right, so for your synchondrosis example, and note the spelling here. See, synchondrosis, the singular form of that word is is, the plural form is es. And if I ask you on an exam, or excuse me, on a quiz, to fill in the blank and the answer is synchondrosis, make sure you give me the singular form, okay? Because remember, the computer is grading this and I have to type in the correct answer, so you need to give me the singular form of the word, okay? All right, so for your example for a synchondrosis, there are 2 down here. You are not learning this one, so you can cross it out if you want to, because we don't do the epiphyseal plate in 243, okay? So the example you need to know is over here, and if you look really close, this is manubrium of the sternum bone, and these are your ribs, and in blue is hyaline cartilage, right? That was your location for hyaline cartilage when we did tissues. Hyaline cartilage is located between ribs and sternum. Well, that's also a type of joint, and specifically it's a synchondrosis joint because you've got hyaline cartilage joining 2 bones, ribs and sternum together, okay? Very similar idea when we get down here to a symphysis. Again, note the spelling, es for plural, is for singular. You want to give me the singular form. Couple of examples. This is the one I'm going to use on the exam. So in between the vertebrae of the vertebral column, you've got these intervertebral discs. You saw when we did tissues that intervertebral discs are made up of fibrocartilage. That was the location of fibrocartilage, was the intervertebral discs in between the vertebrae. And so that's the example I expect you to know for the exam. But, you know, obviously in between the coxal bones, there is a padding of fibrocartilage, and they call that the pubic symphysis. Okay, so there are other examples of symphyses in the human body. If you're looking at the picture really closely, you notice that the intervertebral disc appears to be labeled as hyaline cartilage. That is not a typo. There is a thin amount of hyaline cartilage above and below the intervertebral disc, and they're just pointing that out in this picture. But the bulk of the intervertebral disc is fibrocartilage, so this is a symphysis, okay? And then we get to the synovial joints. Okay, so for the synovial joints, here you have adjoining bones separated by a joint cavity, covered with articular cartilage and enclosed within an articular capsule lined with synovial membrane. And there are 6 different types of synovial joints. These guys are freely movable, so they are a diarthrosis or a diarthrotic joint. And then movement just depends on the design of the joint, and we will discuss that when we get to the second part of this video, okay? Before we get into the picture, I do want to point out this is a potential anatomy short answer for exam 3. So if you're taking notes right now, put this in your notes. This picture is a potential anatomy short answer for exam 3. All right. And I know it looks really busy, but it's actually not very complicated at all. When we consider synovial joints, these are the most common in the human body. They give you the greatest range of motion. And some of these synovial joints have more anatomical structures than you see in this basic picture, okay? But all the synovial joints have this basic anatomical structure. And so at this level, this is what you're responsible for learning with respect to the anatomy of the synovial joint. Okay, so with that said, we'll start with ligament. So we know that a ligament is made up of dense, regular connective tissue, and it connects bone to bone, and that's exactly what we see here. All right. This last structure down here that's labeled as the periosteum, we've also heard of the periosteum. We know that that is a sheath that covers the outer portion of each bone. We know that that fibrous part of the periosteum is dense, irregular connective tissue. And if we follow the little laser pointer on up, it merges to another layer here that is labeled as the fibrous capsule. And then the fibrous capsule appears to be part of a larger structure called the articular capsule. All right, so let's talk about the articular capsule. The articular capsule, also up here, can also be labeled as the joint capsule. So on exam 3, you could label this articular capsule, or you could label it as joint capsule. Either term would be fine. Those are interchangeable terms. The articular capsule is composed of 2 layers. The first layer is the fibrous layer. The fibrous layer is the same thing as the fibrous capsule. Those are 2 terms for the same thing. So on exam 3, you could label this fibrous capsule, or you could label it fibrous layer, and it would be fine either way. All right, it's the outer layer of the articular capsule, and it is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue that is continuous with the periosteum, and that should make sense. Deep to the fibrous layer is the synovial membrane, so it's the inner layer, and in this picture, it is the green line. That's the synovial membrane, okay? It's the inner layer. It's composed of a loose connective tissue, and it covers all the internal joint surfaces not covered by cartilage. Really need to note that this is what makes the synovial fluid. The synovial membrane makes synovial fluid. The synovial membrane makes synovial fluid. When the synovial membrane makes the synovial fluid, where does the synovial fluid go? The synovial fluid, as it leaves the synovial membrane in green, moves into this space that is called the joint cavity. And if you follow the little line on up, the joint cavity contains synovial fluid. So there would be fluid all up in this space right here. Okay? And again, this is true of all the synovial joints in the human body. And so some of these synovial joints occur between very small bones. And so sometimes it's hard to imagine that there's actually fluid in between those bones, but there is. Okay? So this basic structure of a synovial joint applies to all of these different types that we're going to see in the next video. Okay? So in addition to the joint cavity, where you've got the synovial fluid, you've also got in blue the articular cartilage, and the articular cartilage is actually lying on the bone. So the articular cartilage is making contact with the bone. The articular cartilage is composed of hyaline cartilage. The articular cartilage, what type of tissue is it made up of? Hyaline cartilage. And so that is what makes up the synovial joint. You've got an articular capsule with its fibrous capsule and synovial membrane. We've got the articular cartilage that lies on top of the bones. And then we've got our synovial fluid made by the synovial membrane that exists in a space called the joint cavity. Okay? And that's really all there is to it. All right, so this is where we are going to stop this particular video because I don't want these videos to be too terribly long. Moving forward, we will start with this slide in the next video, and we will remind ourselves that there are 6 different types of synovial joints. And in the next video, we're going to go through those 6 different types of synovial joints. All right, thanks guys.